Good afternoon and welcome to this joint event between Who Cares Scotland and the University of Glasgow to discuss care, rights and COVID-19. My name is Kes Dugdale and I'm the Director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow. Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to hear from 4 experts on the topic of care experience before facilitating a bit of a discussion between you and them. If you'd like to pose a question to our panel throughout this event, you can do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And we'll do our best to work through some of those questions in the latter half of this session. We are recording this event in part so that those who can't make it can watch it back, but also to make it available to students at the University of Glasgow, particularly those studying youth policy next semester. Our first speaker today is Megan Sutherland. She's the Vice Chair of Who Cares Scotland, a John Smith Centre intern and a student at the University of Glasgow. In fact, she's the whole impetus for the event today. Having undertaken her undergraduate dissertation on the topic of care, rights and COVID-19, she then used her agency to bring all of the speakers together to focus on her findings, and we are immensely proud of her. I'll ask Megan about her dissertation in a moment. She'll be followed by Bruce Adamson, Scotland's Children and Young People's Commissioner, who will talk to the topic of embedding the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Then we'll hear from Fiona Duncan, the chair of the Promise, who will offer some reflections before our final speaker, Carly Elliott, who's the Director of Influencing at Who Cares Scotland. Carly will explore the role of participation of care experienced people in policymaking before we move to your questions. So there's a lot to talk about. So let's start our discussion with Megan's dissertation. Megan, tell us, why did you pick care, rights and COVID-19 as your topic?
Okay, so I think the pandemic has brought about, for what a lot of people will be the first time, some experience of what it might be like to be in care, to be told, sorry, you can't see your family, for the government to say, you know, we need you to stay here and do this and this and not this, no, you can't go to work, no, you can't go to school. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's been easier for people who are already in the care of the state full time. We know over decades through numerous abuse inquiries, through the work of the Promise, through a number of overarching kind of long-term visionary strategies that the Scottish Government is aiming to implement to kind of address these issues, that children in care do not always have their rights upheld, and that it's quite frequently broken with respect to their right to privacy, their right to family, their right to education, to good healthcare, and overall the kind of the aim of the UNCRC, which says in the preamble to kind of create a family environment where people feel loved and belong. We know that doesn't always happen in care. So I was quite worried as a care experienced person myself, with relationships with young people who were in care, who were telling me things who I hadn't heard from, that was making me really worried, what was actually happening for them, and trying to imagine how my care placements would have responded to COVID. It was something that I wanted to find out what was happening there, and make sure that their voices were being heard.
So how did you go about doing your dissertation then?
Okay. So a lot of the things that were coming out from children's rights organisations, from government, from academics, were all focused on care leavers, which is brilliant because this group face massive challenges. They kind of leave care and they quite often experience poverty. There's just that not kind of support network that people need and that people have particularly been relying on during the pandemic, for help with shopping, for support networks, to help with isolation. But there wasn't really anything coming out about children. I was really, really struggling to kind of find bits relating to children in care in amongst general children and young people reports, to kind of identify, they're actually in care, in a document that was largely talking about care leavers. So I basically ended up reading everything I could find on care and COVID-19, and kind of isolating the bits where people were still in care and working out what the picture was by building up all these little bits of what was actually happening.
So I'm going to ask you in a second to reflect on your recommendations, but before we get to the recommendations, can you talk to us a little bit about what you actually found out? What did you discover was the experience of people in care throughout the pandemic?
Okay, so I ended up with kind of 5 main themes of issues that were pretty widespread, affecting people who were in care. The first one that was kind of most obviously prevalent was poor mental health and a lack of access to mental health treatment. That won't surprise anyone. But for care experienced people who maybe don't have that close family or friend support network, that was just kind of exemplified as the country became more and more lonely, I guess. That was really felt by children in care. Digital and educational exclusion was also one that I was quite disappointed to see, because you would think if you're in the care of the state who also deliver education, you'd be pretty sorted. But actually moving everything online, to relying on technology, using technology to be able to keep in contact with your family, to be able to speak to a counsellor, is quite challenging if you live in a care setting that doesn't allow Wi-Fi or that doesn't provide digital devices. So that one also came up. Voice informal processes is kind of in a similar vein, that moving everything online doesn't work for everyone. This is quite intimidating. I feel quite nervous just now, but I think I'd feel more nervous if I was, trying to explain, no, please don't separate me from my little brother, or no, please don't move me. Trying to talk to these people in fancy suit jackets on Zoom. If I'm not used to that, that would be pretty scary. So yeah, voice informal processes, people weren't really getting an option of how they want to contribute to meetings. It was just, okay, your meeting's on Zoom, hope you have the internet to join. And that was kind of that. Contact and family placements, again, some people were kind of benefiting in that they were maybe getting to stay with their families longer. For other people, their contact was completely disrupted and contact arrangements weren't being held to. But also there's been a kind of anxiety growing among children in care that their placements maybe aren't as secure if they're being sent home for longer periods of time to reduce transmission. Some were finding that carers maybe weren't as keen to have them back, and that there's this whole kind of placement insecurity around moving on from care, coming into care, the numbers of kind of child protection cases soaring, that is causing quite a lot of anxiety for children who aren't very sure where they might be living in a few months' time. And the last one was kind of how restrictions are being applied to care. I think the Scottish Government are doing a terrific job of kind of really quickly putting out general guidance, but people aren't considering, okay, how does this apply if I don't live with my parents? That's great that I can move between mum and dad's house for contact, but you haven't said anything about if I live in a group home. There are things like that, like carers wearing full PPE and kind of leaving meals outside of children's doors we've heard about, it all has a kind of cumulative effect on your well-being, which is going back to the first point about mental health. So that's the kind of whiz tour of what the findings were. I also looked at these through the panel principles, which the Scottish Human Rights Consortium basically say that if you want to take a human rights based approach to policy making, you need to make sure that people who it affects can participate in the design and creation of that policy, and that they feel empowered over what it's going to do and understand what it's for, which COVID policy produced during COVID time wasn't, just because of the sheer kind of rate of the emergency that we had to respond to. The N for panel is for non-discriminatory, which says that basically if you are disadvantaged, policies should not further disadvantage you, they should have mitigating actions. But a lot of what I found was that people just weren't thinking about care. It wasn't that they were deliberately trying to further the adversity of children in care, but if you don't think about it and you don't mitigate against, then of course it's going to have unintended consequences. L is for legal. This report kind of shows all the way through which articles of the UNCRC that it is violating. Children's care plans are not necessarily being followed with regards to contact. There's numerous legal issues, especially for children deprived of their liberty, who are not being able to access healthcare or see their social workers. And the final one is accountability, which for me kind of sum them all up in that I think we've maybe dropped how we scrutinise policy and how we work to improve it because of the sheer pressure that COVID has put on our systems. So that is why in my recommendations I also have some on accountability and upholding rights.
So that's the state of play. in terms of what you've discovered through your dissertation. I think you have in total 18 recommendations about what should change. I'm not going to ask you to list them all today because I don't think we will be able to do that in the 60 minutes that we've got, but just to reassure everybody who's attending today that after the event you will receive a full copy of Megan's dissertation, and you can read through them at length there. She's already described that each of her recommendations is linked both to the UNCRC and to those human rights panel principles, and we'll make sure everybody's got a copy of those documents as well so they can cross-reference it. But in the time that we've got left with you, Megan, do you want to pull out maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 of what you consider to be the most important recommendations, or if you don't want to make them about what's the most important, what you'd like the audience to hear today, and they can read the rest at their leisure?
Okay. I don't think I have a kind of more important ones, but the ones I want to share with you are the ones that are maybe have specifically arisen because of COVID-19, and therefore they maybe weren't considered when things like GERFIC or the Promise or other overarching long-term and really visionary strategies like CHS policies, all of these things that make up the system that we know to be responsible for caring for children might have missed. So the first one under mental health and support is that I was really worried reading about some of the things about children deprived of their liberty. They were kind of being isolated in, basically cells for up to 23 hours a day, not being able to access healthcare, not being able to access showers at all times, not being able to see social workers, family, and independent advocates, despite the UN recommending that all children in detention centres were considered for release. Scotland didn't do that, and the impact on someone's mental health, especially as a child, is just huge. So yeah, the recommendations around that, and also for additional powers for the Commissioner's team to be able to enter and investigate what is actually happening in those places, because there's just not enough information about what day-to-day life is actually like there. The second theme was on restrictions in being in care. And I guess a quite simple recommendation from that was that we're enjoying easier restrictions, but the Scottish Government isn't actually prioritising the children that they have responsibility for in the easing of restrictions. There hasn't been anything to specifically prioritise contact resuming, face-to-face hearings, meeting with other care experienced young people, meeting with independent advocates in face-to-face. There hasn't been that clarity around you're important, you're valued, and we want to get normality back for you as soon as possible because we understand the impact this is having on you. So that's quite a simple but important one. On family contacts and placements, like I said earlier, like we have kind of staff wearing full PPE and it doesn't feel like home. We have kind of young people having to stay places where they don't maybe feel safe or feel happy for longer than they had planned, or measures that health and safety measures that are needed to keep people safe. The onus should be on the staff who are moving about and not on the young person. We can't have a young person staying in situations where they maybe don't feel comfortable in, or preventing them from returning to care because of logistics. If instead we can have staff move, or maybe staff stay over, which we have seen evidence of in some homes, which has gone really well. So it's basically more making sure that that is widespread and not such a kind of lucky postcode lottery. Voice and formal processes is quite simple, really. Is what I was finding was a lot of people are being they're finding barriers in participating into decisions being made about their care just because they're not having choice about how they want to do that. We've kind of moved online and we've reduced the contact, the kind of frequency of these meetings, but there should be options for, do you want to do this in person, kind of socially distanced across a boardroom? Do you want to go somewhere with your advocate or with your teacher and join digitally with them? Do you want to write a letter? Do you want to make a video and send it in? Instead of just saying, okay, we're going to do it on Teams or we're going to do it on Zoom and I hope you have the internet to join. Digital exclusion in education. I think in the 21st century, access to the internet needs to be recognised as a key right for our social, emotional and educational needs. I think there's a role for the Care Inspectorate in making sure that every child has access to digital devices and internet. And what is really important is making sure that that device belongs to the child and not the placement or the local authority. So that if they move, if they leave care, that device goes with them and doesn't plunge them back into digital poverty. And then the final one I want to highlight on upholding rights and accountability kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about some of these consequences are just kind of coming about because people aren't thinking about people in care. And we already have corporate parenting duties in the 2014 Act. People should already be thinking about how does this impact on care experienced people, but we know it's not happening. And the Scottish Government has the ability under Section 58 of the Children and Young People's Act to direct public bodies and encourage private organisations to treat care experience as a protected characteristic without changing legislation. And what this means is that care experience would be on these forms that every policymaker right across government has to do for every single policy government produces. They have to think about what is care experience, does my policy impact on them, how can I mitigate against that? And I think that would kind of offset some of the challenges we've seen over the last year with policy being made for the whole population rather than by all sectors, rather than just from the children and families team who actually understand what this is like. It needs to be a mainstream conversation.
An absolute tour de force, Megan. There is so much in that. And as I say, everybody will be able to read the full thing via their email boxes tomorrow. So thank you for that. You can relax a little bit now. Jill, we are going to come back to you after we've heard from all of the speakers just to get some reflections from you. But if I can ask Bruce Adamson just to unmute and invite Scotland's Children and Young People's Commissioner just to reflect on anything he's heard from Megan so far, and also to talk about the degree to which embedding the UNCRC will impact on all of this going forward.
Thanks, Kez, and thanks to Who Cares and the John Smith Centre and the University of Glasgow, and particularly thanks to Megan. I would have just listened to you for the whole hour, Megan. I think you're doing such a good job at not only setting out the broad framework, but the real specifics about what we need to do. So thank you for your leadership, and your dissertation, which you'll be kindly sharing, I think is a really powerful tool for all of us and a real focal point for today's discussion, because the last 15 months has been incredibly challenging. In April last year, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child warned of the grave physical and psychological effects of this pandemic would have on children, and we've really seen them come to pass over the last year and a bit, and particularly on care experienced children and young people and others. And the UN had called on Scotland and other countries to take a human rights-based response, not just to focus on public health, but to look at the broad framework of rights, economic, social and cultural rights. And unfortunately, I don't think that we've done enough to do that. Last July, the Observatory on Children's Human Rights in Scotland and ourselves did an independent children's rights impact assessment, which focused on lots of the areas that, Megan, you've picked up and built on. And it's concerning to me that was July last year that we were identifying things, the work that you've done, Megan, and Who Cares and others have done. We're still not turning that into the practice change that we need. And we've seen the impact on education rights and health and family rights and play and socialization. And they've really had a disproportionate impact, particularly on groups like care experienced children and young people, but also recognizing the impact on disabled children, on young carers, those living in poverty, many of whom are care experienced as well. And so I think that complexity of focus we need to really, really focus on. And there's been a distinct lack of the tools that you talked about, Megan, as well, in terms of things like impact assessments, where we've already got models in place, but we seem to have forgotten to use them because we've been working in crisis mode. And I think things like impact assessment, and particularly the participation of children and young people who are directly experienced, has really been lost. And so I think that's really important. But in my short contribution, I want to focus maybe on one of the positives, which is what we've seen over the last year and a bit is particularly children and young people and others acting as human rights defenders and really challenging those in power to do better. And that's helped secure commitments to a stronger legal framework. And the really exciting part of that was the passing of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child Incorporation Scotland Bill back in March. It is the most important thing that we can do in domestic legal terms to ensure that rights are respected, protected and fulfilled. And it really has been kind of a bright ray of sunlight in what's been a very gloomy year. As you had said, Megan, the beauty of the convention is that it starts with this idea that every child should grow up in a family environment of happiness, love and understanding, and then goes on to set out a broad array of rights that ensure that children should be treated with dignity and fairness, that they're protected, and that they develop to their full potential in a way that allows them to be part of their communities. And so it builds on the Charter of the United Nations, which recognizes the inherent dignity and inalienable rights that we all have, and breathes life into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaimed childhood as a time of special care and assistance. And so it's this really powerful international law that we're going to make real in Scotland as soon as we've got it past the Supreme Court and got it commenced, which I hope will happen later this year. And so it is really exciting. And what's most exciting about it, I think, for the context of your recommendations, Megan, in our discussion today, is that it has within it a commitment to use all available resources to the maximum extent possible. So that's money, but it's also laws and policies to make sure that rights are met. And this commitment to a family environment, and so all the work on focusing on the state's role to support families, a strength-based approach to ensure that things like social security are in place, like adequate standard of living and housing, all of the issues that you've picked up, Megan, sit within the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And when we see the state's obligation to use all of its resources to address them, this is going to give us a real potential to challenge those making decisions. It also has particular focus on care experience. And so when the state fails to properly support a family and needs to intervene in family life, that triggers special protection and assistance. So care experienced children and young people have additional rights and additional focus within the convention. And so that plays out in things like corporate parenting and the work that's being led by the Promise, but it's going to set at the base of all decision making now is this commitment to the special care and assistance that we owe to children and young people. I'm going to try and keep to time, so I'm not going to talk about the structure of the bill too much, rather than just to say that it's a bit like the Human Rights Act. So what it'll mean is that, except it's stronger, what it'll mean is that everyone who's in power, everyone who's making a decision has to act compatibly with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And if they don't, then we can take legal action against them. So every law that's passed, every action that's taken has to comply with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that's going to be hugely powerful. But in addition to that, it actually requires the government and public bodies to be proactive and set out a scheme and set out the ways and the ways in which what they're doing is compliant with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So there's positive duties as well. And then very strong legal powers for the Children's Commissioner and others to take action when there is that failure. So my commitment to you, Megan, and to everyone who's on this call today is that I'm going to be using all of the powers of my office and all of the powers of the bill to make sure that we can take your recommendations and the other things that care experienced children and young people have called for to make sure that we deliver that change. And so I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bruce. Some really strong commitments there from you, and 140 witnesses to hear you say them. So they will be heard across the land. Thank you for that, and we'll bring you back in when we get to the Q&A. 140 people here, but only 2 questions so far. So feel free to start putting some of those into the Q&A box. If I can invite Fiona to unmute and introduce herself as the chair of the Promise and the work of the Promise. Welcome, Fiona.
Thanks, Kez. Thanks, Bruce, and special thanks to Megan for bringing us all here and for her incredibly powerful contribution to the evidence base. As Megan really rightly pointed out, the independent care review concluded last February before COVID struck. At that point, its reports and conclusions were accepted in full, and Scotland made a commitment to keep the promise to its children's families, all based on one of the reports called The Promise, which painted a vision for Scotland. In terms of the impact of COVID on the Promise and the team's ability to deliver that, there's quite a lot. One of the things that I particularly liked about what Megan said a moment ago is that she doesn't have a most important recommendation, that all 18 are important. And one of the reasons that the care review didn't produce reports with numbered conclusions is because historically governments they've got form for picking the ones with the lower number and say these are the more important ones. And actually what the care review did, and I think what Megan has done really beautifully, is paint a picture of a bunch of things that have to happen all together, that you can't just cherry pick certain parts and leave out other parts. So in terms of the impact of COVID, again, I'd like to start with what Megan said. She's already observed that so many children and young people live under the circumstances of COVID who are in care settings already. So during the care review, I was also responsible for chairing the care review. I went to places where there was a no touch policy, so children weren't being hugged. They weren't being read stories at night. They were finding that their life was limited by the system and the decisions that the system was making for them. So the care community already had a real insight into life restricted by the state. What the global pandemic did, I think, in Scotland was it demonstrated beyond doubt that public services are not fit for purpose in a crisis. And I think it's fair to say that when the state intervenes in family life, that is a crisis. So I think it really highlighted that we don't have a set of services that will support children and families. It also showed that things that were previously impossible became possible in Scotland. So I know Megan works and has worked in the area of homelessness and rough sleeping. You know, Scotland made a really big commitment around a shared vision to do something different, and that happened as a result. I think there's also parts of the care system, which isn't a system, that responded to COVID in a positive way. So again, Megan touched on some of the children's homes that had staff stay in for longer and create what felt more like a family life rather than shift life. But there was also truly abhorrent things happening, like staff going into children's homes in full PPE. I mean, like unbelievable. Since last April, the Scottish Government has been gathering data every week from all 32 local authorities that helps show how the pandemic has impacted on Scotland's vulnerable children and young people. But again, just as Megan's highlighted and just as the care review highlighted, typically the data that the system collects is system data. It doesn't explain the experience of children and families, and it talks about the setting as opposed to how somebody feels. So I think what Megan's done is produced a really powerful challenge to that. In March this year, the Promise team produced Plan 21-24, which is the first 3 years of implementation for the care review. And the team looked at 71 discrete pieces of research into how the system had responded, into responses to COVID, and of those 71, only 7 of them looked properly at the experiences. So there's a real dearth of understanding about how things feel. And again, this is something that the care community has known for a very long time, and one of the reasons that Who Cares and others were lobbying for a care review. So the big challenge that we have is the system data doesn't reflect the experience or the whole life. And I think Megan's incredibly powerful research makes a significant contribution to this and challenges this, and really helps further highlight why the system has to move away from measuring what matters to them and move towards what matters to children and young families. A couple of final points is during the pandemic, due to social distancing measures, quite a lot of face-to-face relational work was reduced. And as a consequence of that, there was less qualitative data. But the upside to that is, and I'm really conscious that you've reminded me that this has been recorded and here are the sorts of things that I get into so much trouble for saying out loud, but quite a lot of families reported that the reduction in folks checking in on them and checking up on them allowed them a bit more breathing space and the ability to focus on one another. So there is something about what is, so the families who feel under pressure from different departments, different parts of the state to conform to do this or meet that target or meet the next target, felt that a lot of that pressure was removed and that they were finding ways to thrive together. So to conclude the point, I like to have my props with me, and because I am so pleased that you're wearing a jacket that matches the care review's cover. I just think that that's above and beyond, but a wonderful thing that you've done today. I'm hoping that you've got one this colour as well. So the care review highlighted that to do something so simple yet so complex as to radically reform this thing that we call a care system so that it meets the needs of children and families, which is national services and system and local services and system, then we needed to build a collaborative plan, a plan that all of the different organisations and agencies that had to change shape or that had to change first were involved in. And as I say, at the end of March, we published Plan 21-24. And that's what has to happen over the next 3 years for the big step for the promise to be kept. And I think what Megan's work has done has really highlighted the operating environment for that plan. So of her 18 recommendations, there are 10 that I cannot see a good reason for people not doing right now. So there are 10 that already should be the baseline, should be the starting point. Some of them I think we might have to be, I say we, Megan, I really mean you, have to be more challenging towards government, the state, the scrutineers, etc., the people who hold budgets. Some of them will take more work, but at least 10 of them should be an absolute given. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we looked at 71 pieces of research and we tried to condense that into the Plan 21-24, and Kezzy, I'll make sure that everyone's got the links to all of these things if they want them. And so there's 5 pages in there about the impact of COVID, and we end on the note of hope, because actually we have reached a moment in time where we realise that we have to build forward. What we've got isn't fit for purpose, and I think that we need to start from a different place and do things differently, and I think that Megan's work provides us with a really clear articulation of what good looks like.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Fiona. I can see the number of questions has ramped up quite considerably as you were talking, so some of them may be coming your way shortly. Our final speaker before we go to open session is Carly Elliott, Director of Influencing at Who Cares Scotland. And I wonder, Carly, if I could ask you to focus on why participation of care experienced people in policymaking is so important, and how you think Scotland might be able to enable this as we begin to recover from this horror thing we call the pandemic.
Thank you. Yeah, so as many of us will know, Article 12 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child states that children have the right to participate in decisions that affect them. And many of us, myself included, are very quick to highlight the importance of this right in our day-to-day work. And yet, while the importance of Article 12 is often cited, the methods through which it's realised in practice vary considerably depending on the context in which it happens. Well-considered effective participation can have many positive consequences for children individually, collectively, but also in benefiting greater society as well. When done well, participation can lead children to develop greater confidence, a sense of active citizenship, and it can overall lead to better policy making, which represents the genuine experiences and views of children. The participation of children in policymaking is essential in ensuring that Scotland takes a rights-based approach to moving through and beyond the pandemic. Megan's already highlighted the panel principles. The first of those principles is participation for that reason. However, before discussing how this might happen, I just want to take a moment to reflect on some of the challenges that care experienced children face with regards to participation more generally. So as we know, due to the role of the state in their lives and the legality that often surrounds their childhoods, care experienced children deserve specific consideration when we think about what Article 12 means for them in practice. However, this specific consideration can bring with it both opportunities and challenges for participation. So, for example, children who grow up in care can be faced with a significant number of formal meetings, processes or forums in which their right to participate should be fulfilled on an individual level. But equally, this level of individual participation can feel overwhelming, and it can place a huge expectation on children in terms of how they participate. And this is one reason why the offer of things like independent advocacy is such an important one for children navigating the care system, someone independent of their care that can ensure that their right to participate is fulfilled. Likewise, over the course of a number of years, Scotland has become increasingly open to the participation of children in both local and national policymaking through the provision of participatory forums like champions boards, accessible national consultations, and the introduction of child rights and wellbeing impact assessments through the 2014 Children and Young People Act. Now, while driven by positive intent, sometimes such participatory opportunities can still feel tokenistic or inaccessible to many children, particularly those who face significant barriers to rights fulfilment in the first place, such as is the case for many care experienced children. In the context of the pandemic, at Who Cares Scotland, we've seen a reduction in both the want or the ability for many children to participate. even in long-standing group settings in which they already feel comfortable. The need to engage via digital platforms across all aspects of their lives is taking a toll both on children and professionals, whether that's through children's hearings, LAC reviews, or generally participation groups across the country. And as a result, we're seeing the impact on quality participation that's enabled to be delivered. So such challenges faced by care experienced children should be considered in their entirety if we are to reinvigorate and realise the right to participation moving forward and through the pandemic. In her dissertation, Megan highlights that while care experienced children already face significant challenges in having their rights met, the pandemic has exacerbated this, as we've already touched on quite a lot today. And this is particularly in relation to the right to an education, adequate housing, the right to health, and the list goes on. Likewise, in her work, Megan rightly highlights the impact that the pandemic has had on the ability for children to participate in local and national level policy making, particularly around the design of emergency legislation and policy, as again Megan's I think highlighted today already. Now, this existing duo of threat to child rights alongside limited participation in policy making has played its part in leaving many children and young people feeling left behind or ill-informed about the pandemic and the associated measures and how they impact on their day-to-day lives. This was something that was highlighted strongly in our recent COVID-19 recovery planning report, with 61% of our care experience membership reporting that they felt unsure how to access support and engage with professionals in the first 6 months of the pandemic. So children's participation in designing and implementing policy that impacts child rights will be crucial to the formation of effective reparative solutions. And so it's essential that in the context of the pandemic, that Scotland takes a fresh look at how care experienced children are empowered to participate in local and national policy making. So with this in mind, how can the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament and wider society ensure that children's participation is inclusive, that it's respected and that it's embedded in our policy making? There are just 5 crucial elements that I want to just quickly cover today. First of all, we must ensure that participation methodologies are considered early on in the policy-making cycle, with consideration given to why participation is being catered for and what strengths it brings. We quite often create space for participation without truly understanding the value and the purpose of doing this. And if professionals and services don't believe in or understand why participation is important, then it will be felt by the children that are involved in the participation activity. Second on my list would be that we ensure that this early planning provides enough time to deliver effective participation. Often we find that opportunities for children to share their views or to take part in policy making can be bound by tight timeframes that don't necessarily allow for meaningful informed participation to take place in the first place. Third on the list would be that we need to ensure that participatory policy making doesn't become a numbers game. This was something that Fiona and I spoke about regularly throughout the course of the independent care review. We want to measure participation effectively to ensure that we're being inclusive, but it's also equally important to strive to offer quality participation rather than being driven by a target number. Fourth on the list would be that we need to provide adequate financial resource to allow for flexible, creative and youth-led design of participation. Adequate resource is vital in ensuring the best participation methods can be chosen to bridge policy making with the needs of the children who want to be involved. So do we want to use creative expression through the arts? Should we ensure that research involves peer research models? Do we create accessible roundtable formats which attempt to reduce the power imbalance? Such methods require more resource and time than is typically provided for participation projects, but the investment is worth it. And lastly, we want to ensure, or we must ensure, that when children are involved in participation, that they understand where their views have gone and what changes have been made as a result. This feedback loop is most often forgotten. And given the timescales around policy implementation, it's a really hard thing to deliver on, but it's a crucial element to ensure that effective participation, and one that we know children and young people ask for time and time again. So these 5 considerations are just some elements that can strengthen participatory policy making, but are essential if policymakers genuinely want children to participate in policy formation and implementation, especially for children who typically face significant barriers in having their rights met. Not only is this important for children now, but by doing this, we then raise a generation of children who will understand the importance of public policy participation and will be more likely to protect such youth-led mechanisms as our future adults. And I'll just stop there.
Wonderful, Carly, thank you. I'm just thinking this is hopefully a cracking example of kind of youth-led participation in policy making, having your dissertation on the topic. I don't think it gets better than that. So that's us heard from our 4 speakers. I'm grateful to you all for putting in your questions to the Q&A. I'm going to try and approach these in a sort of thematic approach, although they're very broad ranging. But before I do that, Megan, quick fire round for you. Anything you'd like to say back based on what you've heard? Any immediate thoughts you'd like to share with the room?
I guess just it's quite clear that the UNCRC is a floor, not a ceiling, and if we're already not meeting that, Scotland is not going to fulfil its numerous aspirations to be the best place in the world to grow up, to have the best care for children, to get it right for every single child, even if they're in care. We know that there is, I feel like Scotland loves a long-term visionary strategy, but there's 18 immediately actionable things, like Fiona said, right here that are actually going to affect this generation, are going to affect the young people that I know that are in care today, and not in 10 years. And you know, I've heard so much about how the country wants to build back better, to build back fairer, and often these conversations focus kind of solely on wealth. Because we know poverty is such a huge driver of inequalities, but actually the inequalities between the most privileged and the children in the state are really shameful, and they're not even considered. So yeah, I guess my one kind of message would be conversations on building back better and creating a fairer society need to make sure they include people who experience the very most barriers to that.
Combined with a greater sense of urgency. I'm getting that. That's true.
Yeah.
Okay. But Bruce, is there anything you want to say to that quickly before we go to questions? You don't have to, but if you'd like to, you're welcome.
Yeah, only because I can see it coming through as a strong theme in the questions as well, and strongly agree with what Megan's saying in terms of it's about turning the rhetoric into action. And one of the things that incorporation of CRC does is actually gives real legal tools. But what we've seen in other countries that have already incorporated is you don't see a huge rise in legal cases, because the fact that the legal case, the potential for it exists, that really focuses minds at local authority level and decision-making level to actually do all the things that we're discussing, particularly around participation, because of the threat. As soon as you get lawyers involved, or the threat of lawyers involved, it does tend to focus minds. So my hope is that we'll see that cultural change quite quickly, as they've seen in other countries that have already done this.
I think my dog might just have made an appearance. Everybody started smiling there. Thank you for that, Bruce. So I'm going to work my way through the Q&A now. Megan, the first couple are really about the methodology behind your dissertation, and then the next 2 are really coming your way, Bruce, which are about the UNCRC again. But let's just go with a couple of combined questions from Megan. The first is, did you explore why the COVID guidance for children's services was slow to be developed? And secondly, through your dissertation, did you discover if there was any difference in how care was delivered during COVID across different settings? And if so, what was the difference maker?
Okay. On the why was guidance for care coming out later, my understanding of this is that it's because not everyone who writes policies knows about care, thinks about care. This is what I was saying about if we put it on an equality impact assessment, people actually have to write about something, whereas we know that otherwise things kind of get kicked towards the children and families team in Scottish Government. There's quite an othering that goes around children involved with social work, and that's a social worker's job, and people just don't really think about it. So for example, when we had the Scottish Government come out with guidance on if your parents live in different homes, and they sort of said, of course you can move between different homes, you need to see both your parents, that's fine, that's essential travel. there wasn't anything in it initially about, well, what if I live in a group setting? What if I live in care? Can I go and see my granny? Can I go see my sister? Like, how many homes can I go and see? There was so many questions that the workforce in the care sector were trying to kind of adapt into care in 32 different versions. It was only after it was kind of raised by the third sector, by the frontline professionals with the Scottish Government, that they then went, oh, okay, we need some extra guidance there. I have a recommendation on Scottish Government. If they're going to make really reactive and quick policies, they need to make sure they really quickly listen to what the feedback is on it as well, and make reactive fixes. Does that cover that, Kez?
Yes, I think so.
Um,
Do you want to keep talking, or I can come back to you?
The second question.
Yep.
On different types of care. So if you're in care, you could be in foster care, residential care, kinship with a family member, living at home with your parents under social work supervision, or you could be in a secure care centre deprived of your liberty. I decided right at the start that I wanted to focus on people who were in foster care and residential care and secure care, because we know that one of the biggest issues for people who are living at home with different family members will be poverty. It should be completely different if you're actually in a setting that the state is directly funding. And I didn't have the 10,000 words to do the justice to all the different type of placements. I think I'm actually way over the word count, but we'll pretend I didn't say that on a recording. So yeah, I wanted to focus on foster care, residential care, because money should not be an issue. You should have everything you need if the state is your £1 billion parent. I think that was the sentence that makes sense. But yeah, basically the bigger the settings got, the more kind of rigid, and yeah, as you can imagine, if you're living in a place with more people during a pandemic, that's when you start getting the meals left outside the doors. That's where you start to stay in your room. That's where staff are wearing PPE. Whereas in foster homes, families were kind of, the biggest issue was maybe that they didn't want to allow contact because they didn't want to put their own family at risk. So yeah, that was kind of the main differences.
Okay, thank you for that. The next two questions are heading Bruce's way, but if any of the other speakers would like to contribute an answer to them, just sort of give me a little wave or point in my direction, no problem. And I appreciate, Bruce, you have answered these in text in the chat forum, but just to kind of facilitate a bit of discussion and let people hear from you personally, I'll combine the two together. Can you give us an example of the kind of action or practice that could be challenged through the convention once it's enshrined in law? And separately to that, people looking for an update really on the legal challenge that you mentioned. What stage are we at with the Secretary of State's challenge to the incorporation of the UNCRC, and what measures will be put in place to ensure specialised ring-fenced financial support for lawyers to represent children and families whose rights are violated following incorporation? That's a really good point, actually. So it's one thing having a set of rights, it's quite another thing about having the ability to access those rights. Some comments from you would be really welcome, Bruce.
Brilliant, thanks. They're all really good questions. I'll answer them slightly out of order, and I'll answer the middle one first on the Supreme Court challenge. The most important thing to realise about the Supreme Court challenge is that the UK government hasn't challenged the Scottish Parliament's right to pass this law or anything about the basis of the law. They've taken a challenge on two very specific parts of it, and one is about the extension that we've made around who the law applies to. Because the Human Rights Act's been interpreted quite narrowly to only certain public bodies, and that's allowed situations where sometimes things have been outsourced and human rights obligations haven't been applied there. So one of the things that we did was we got amendments to expand the scope of who it applies to, and the UK government's concerned that that's gone too far. So that's one element of it. And the other element is around Westminster legislation, which could be caught by the bill when it's on devolved matters. So it's two very specific technical points that are being discussed, and I'm very confident that they'll be resolved fairly quickly. And the worst case scenario is they get narrowed a little bit. So everything that we've been talking about in terms of the bill, none of that will change. In terms of timing, the Supreme Court set it for hearing on the 28th and 29th of June. We're having discussions with the court at the moment in terms of what role we might play in that. and obviously other devolved jurisdictions have got an interest as well. But the hope is that the hearing will be able to take place in late June, and then a decision, I would hope, the Supreme Court would see the urgency of it and get us an answer reasonably quickly. And then in the bill that was passed, the Act was to come into force 6 months after royal assent, but there's a provision that allows earlier commencement than that. So my hope is that we can get it resolved in the Supreme Court reasonably quickly, and government will bring forward early commencement. So my hope is still that we'll have this in effect pretty much as planned later in the year, but I am an optimist, so I may be wrong, but that's what I'm hoping for. In terms of the first question around specific examples, what we've seen, I mean, I'm a litigator by trade, and I think the court has a place, but it's the worst possible way to resolve issues. By the time you get to court, things that have, the state's already failed. So what we've seen in other countries that have already got laws in place like this is what you see as a change in culture and a change in practice. And a lot of the things that Megan's talked about in terms of things like impact assessments, and Carly's talked about things like participation, because you know that you've got to do these things and you can be held into account, you actually get that culture change. And the change in the courts that we see is more reference to the Convention on the Rights of the Child in cases that would already have been there when there's issues with education or there's issues with healthcare. So what we would expect to see is probably more reference to rights in the cases that where things have already got wrong, but the big change we're looking for is cultural change. In terms of if I've got any strategic litigation lined up, the areas where I think that there probably is some scope for further litigation is particularly around poverty and the decisions that budget holders make around how they allocate funds. And so I think things around adequate standard of living that aren't well protected within our current legal framework are probably where we might look to see some cases. And the need to ensure that legal aid's available and support's available for taking cases, that's absolutely true. And you'll all know that there's big problems with the current system, and we need to do a lot more. It's an important, access to justice is a really important right. I'd preface it by saying that I hope that fewer cases go to court because we get a culture change, and yeah, going to court's the worst possible place to resolve an issue. So we do need to ring fence funds. We do need to increase rights awareness amongst the legal community, and we're doing work with the Judicial Studies Institute. So we want to see changes there. But where I'd prefer to see the investment in would be advocacy services, support services, training around rights in and of themselves. And so we are in those discussions, but in other countries, what we've seen is more of that cultural change. And so it wouldn't be where I'd put the vast amount of money is into the legal redress system. Rather, we need to look at ways in which things can be resolved by involving children and young people properly supported at the earliest possible stage. So I hope that answers those questions quickly.
It does, Bruce, thank you. And in summary, we want the legal system to be supported, but we don't necessarily want to have to use it, I think is kind of where we're at there. I've got another question, but this time I'm throwing it in the direction of Carly and Fiona. And then I'm going to kind of try and summarise 3 questions together, which all are about increasing participation of care experience in the process. There are more questions beyond that, but I'm looking at the clock, so I'll let the speakers judge how in-depth they want to be with their answers versus the balance of questions that we can get through. So here's one for Fiona and Carly. What practical measures can third sector organisations take to support care experienced young people during the recovery from the pandemic? So not necessarily what you can do in your own organisations, but what your advice is to the people watching today or beyond it about what they can do now to support young care experienced people. And I know from the registration list, we've got a lot of people who are working in this field every single day on the call. So what can they do? Who wants to speak first? Fiona, you kick off.
To start, and then I'll hand over to Carly, who's an expert in this area. So Megan's already highlighted this. We need to think about what can be done right now. You know, we have a 10-year aspiration to keep the promise, but we don't have to wait to do the things that are absolutely critical, important, urgent. And one of them has to be embedding, listening to children and young people and involving them in a meaningful way in making decisions. And that sounds like a really easy sentence to say out loud, but as Carly's about to say, it is much more nuanced and sophisticated than that. You have to understand where the power sits, and you have to make sure that you're doing it appropriately. But there are many, many things in the care review's conclusions that could happen right now. We could get rid of stigmatising language, for example. We don't need to wait 10 years to do that. So what the promise is doing is really driving for the change that can happen now. I think if we can get participation and meaningful participation done in a way which balances that quantity and quality part that Carly was nodding to earlier about, you have to make sure that you're listening to children that are fully representing the system, not just the ones who are supported to articulate their stories, that it's reaching the ones that, I hate the expression hard to reach. I think if somebody's hard to reach, it's because I'm not trying hard enough. But I do think there's something in that would prevent us from ricocheting from one set of research conclusions or one set of outcomes to another. It would actually drive a sort of iterative and evolutionary change. So that would be my big plea. But I think that, you know, as I said a moment ago, it's not as straightforward as come in and tell me what's going on, because actually that in itself can be traumatizing, and it can be really challenging. It can be a really inappropriate way to engage children. I've got some other points that I was going to answer some of the other points, but I'm going to leave that, because I'm conscious of time, and I'll maybe put a note in your pack.
Lovely. Carly?
Yeah, just quickly to add to what Fiona's already said, I think there's a really interesting opportunity for third sector organisations to also think about how they take a rights-based approach to influencing policy. Megan, sorry, did I freeze there?
You did, but you're back. Keep going.
Okay. So Megan, I think is, and you're...
You did it again.
There we go.
Go for it. I'll give it one more bash.
Yeah, you're going to be sending out a link to the panel principles, and I think there's a really interesting opportunity for third sector organisations to think about how we as organisations hold ourselves accountable to these principles, to make sure that we are in creating opportunities for care experienced people to participate in the work that we do, and how we influence Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, whoever it might be, how we hold ourselves accountable, how we make sure that it's inclusive of all different types of care experience and the intersection with other identities, how we're empowering young people to use their voice to influence, and how we are making sure that they're informed of the kind of the legality around about their lives. I think it'll be really interesting, any third sector organisations here today, if you get the email from Megan and Kez after this, to consider how you might embed the panel principles in the work that you do to make sure we're taking a rights-based approach to moving through the pandemic.
We've got all of that, Carly, so thank you for that. I'm going to let the event just run over ever so slightly after 1 o'clock, because I want to give everybody another chance just to answer this final batch of questions, which are all to do with engaging young people in the participation of policy making. That does mean there are going to be questions from today's event that we didn't get to. I'm grateful to the panellists who have been, on some instances, been able to answer them in written form on the section. But I'm sure that given we've had this event today, we've created all sorts of new avenues for you to talk to each other and to keep this conversation going after the event. And you will be able to do that through all the different resources you're going to receive in your email inboxes tomorrow. So let me just try and wrap up 3 questions together and ask each of the speakers just to address that and anything else they want to say. Megan, I'm going to give you the last word, so you've got the most amount of time to prep for this. But just in summary, we're looking for a bit more from the speakers on how you encourage people with lived experience to do more of this type of research. I think there's a strong vibe today, Megan, that this is really valuable. So how do you create an environment where more of it can happen? In addition to that, is there a place for a forum, perhaps hosted by Who Cares, one speaker says, which shares best practice to strengthen everyone's response to young persons' views and needs? And also there was another question linked to that, which was, there's a great message here about getting experts into spaces where decisions happen, but we know there are lots of barriers. How would you ensure the ladder you're on, Megan, is extended further to increase access for care experienced experts to be involved? So broadly, how do you get more lived experience led research? How do you broaden or take away the barriers that people face in order to do that? And should there be more formal structured spaces to promote this type of participation? And I'm going to come to you, Bruce, then Fiona, then Carly, and end with Megan, and then you can all go have your lunch. So Bruce, on the spot.
Brilliant. Yes to all of that. I mean, obviously my focus is on children and young people. So I go up to 21 for care experience. And I think one of the important things that we can do at children and young people's level is to get them used to being involved, so we can start at a very, very early age. And I think there's a lot more we can do so that children and young people grow up very used to being involved in decision making, feeling empowered, all of that panel principle stuff. But we have to start that really young. So but by the time you're ready to go on to the amazing careers that you can go on to, you've already got that expectation. So I think that's a really important thing. And that requires at all levels for those in power to change the way they exercise that power and to share that power a bit more and actually go to the places where children and young people are, actually get out from around the table, remove all of the barriers that are linked to kind of jargon and all of that stuff, and actually work directly, particularly with children and young people in the spaces that are meaningful to them, and create that culture where decision making happens everywhere and that it's not restricted to places that we traditionally see as places of power.
Thank you. Fiona?
Because as you know already, the Care Review's vision is that the people who will be in receipt of public services are heavily involved in their design, their delivery and their evaluation. So it's at all stages. It's from policy right through to practice and evaluation, and it's end to end. And I think some of the things that Megan said are really powerful lessons for us. I think Bruce is right. There's an issue around power. There's an issue around confidence. There's an issue around making sure it is done appropriately. One of the things that I would want not to see is somebody going, okay, and the Care Review tried really hard to get this right, and I don't think we always did get it right, is, so you're here, Kez, because you're a politician and you're an academic, and you're here, Megan, because this is your experience. So I don't like the othering, because people are all of their experiences and all of their knowledge and all that they bring into a room, not just the one label that possibly a policymaker might be interested in them from. So I'm really conscious of some of the pitfalls around doing this in a way that isn't sensitive and thoughtful. I want it to happen.
Thank you. Carly?
Yeah, I think I've already touched a little bit on some of the things that I think should happen to progress this better investment for organisations that do this type of work, who are able to spend the time supporting young people, enabling them to understand what participation means for them and how to utilise it to influence change. I also think larger constructs like the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament need to think about how they embed meaningful participatory structures within their policy making from start to finish. And that's not just about creating national accessible consultations, it's about a much more integrated model of participation that is open and inclusive and understands that kind of broad range of needs. I think if we had that before the pandemic, we might have seen more involvement of young people in the design of policy throughout the course of this.
Lovely, thank you. And the final word to Megan, what's the answer?
I think everybody has a responsibility to examine who has the power in this relationship. Am I asking them to come into my space? Am I making myself accessible to them? And also ask yourselves, would you have been as kind of tolerant to listen to me if I wasn't as articulate, if I didn't speak as clearly, and if I hadn't had the opportunities that I have to be able to put across my thoughts like this? Because within the care experience community, I have a lot of privilege, and I want to use that to open doors for others. But it starts with the big policymakers, the big power holders. You know, when I started this dissertation, I thought, do you know what? I don't think this is what the uni will want. It's not written very academically. It's very much just my own views. Sometimes I'm finding it hard to be, well, someone else said this. I'm like, well, I said it. But, you know, it's what I wanted to do because it's the voices that I wanted to get out. So there's responsibility on everyone to go, are we making ourselves accessible to people who maybe have a different perspective from us? And are we sharing the power out?
And I mean, you talk about being aware of your privilege, but I think, and I hope you know, that after today, you've used that privilege to huge effect today in bringing all of these experts and people who work on these issues every single day together to discuss the core evidence base that you found during your dissertation, and indeed the list of recommendations that you're advocating from as a consequence of the work that you've done. So huge credit to you for what you've achieved. And who cares what mark you get, right? You've already changed the world. So let's just settle on that. We'll write to the principal and vouch for you collectively as a crowd of 140 people here today. Thank you so much to everybody who has attended today's event. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. As I've mentioned a couple of times, you will get an email tomorrow with lots of links and lots of means by which we can continue this conversation. But we do appreciate your time. Thanks to the speakers for joining us. Thanks to Megan for writing her dissertation. And thanks to Who Cares Scotland and the University of Glasgow for facilitating this event today. Have a great afternoon and we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks and bye for now.